Well, good evening. This is the January 26, 2022 meeting of the Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission. Welcome, everybody. We have a couple of special guests. Councilwoman Gina Teruscio is with us, and Tyler Palmer, Deputy City Supervisor, and we're going to be talking with them about some water issues a little bit later in the meeting. So let's move forward. First item on the agenda is approval of the January 12th minutes. Do we have any additions, corrections, deletions?
So
Victoria?
I emailed out what I thought needed a clarification in that one sentence, and Jennifer and I just worked that out, so we got the wording
Super.
down now.
Okay,
So with that amendment that she's going to do.
okay. Do we have a motion to approve?
I'll make a
Okay,
motion.
Drew, Drew, you're second. Okay, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Okay. Next item is public comment period. If anybody would like to speak with the commission about issues and items that are not on the agenda tonight, we would welcome your input. So seeing none, we will move on to the next item, which is the public hearing. The proposed rezone for an approximately 4-acre area located at 1604 and 1704 East D.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. So before you tonight, we have a public hearing for proposed rezone of approximately 4-acre property located at 1604, 1704 East D Street within the city. The applicant's John Stanuski. He's requesting the rezone of this approximately 4-acre property. It's on the northeast corner of Mountain View and D Street. Proposed rezones from the current farm ranch outdoor recreation zone to the moderate density single family residential zone, which is our R2 zoning district. And this is the subject property at the center of your screen, outlined in red. You can see Mountain View and D Street there. That northeast corner, got Moscow Middle School to the west. There's a Fosburg property, which has single family dwelling and a conservation easement on it to the south across D Street. To the north and to the northeast and to the east is primarily single family residential development. There are some twin homes that are constructed within the last few years on the east side of Mountain View Drive. So closer view of the property, you can see there's 2 single family dwellings on this property and really a pasture field area to the north. And the whole goal of the rezone is to eventually come back with a lot line adjustment in order to divide off a smaller portion of the single family dwellings, one located here and the other located here. And it's my understanding that this will be retained in the conservation easement for the remainder of the property. Looking at the current comprehensive plan land use designation, it's currently designated as auto urban residential, as well as the properties to the north, east, and to the south. Moscow Middle School is currently civic institutional there to the west, as well as the skate park. Taking a look at that states in the comprehensive plan, auto urban residential designated areas currently contain predominantly single-family detached homes on lots ranging from 7,000 to 11,000 square feet in size. More isolated from surrounding uses, may require residents to rely more on automobile transportation. Generally anticipated to be developed low to moderate density, between 3 to 6 units per acre. Could include a mixture of single-family twin homes, townhouses. And then it points to the R1, R2, and R3 zoning districts as the most appropriate zoning districts for this designation. That brings us to the current zoning configuration of the area. It's currently designated as farm ranch. Property to the south, which is also owned by Fosburg Manor LLC, is within the agricultural forestry zone. Surrounding property within single family residential R2 zone to the west, north, and to the east. With those residential subdivisions. Then on the south side of F Street, you do have some R3, which is medium density residential. The proposal before you tonight is to rezone to the R2 zone, consistent with really the surrounding properties to the west, north, and to the east here. Looking at what the zoning code says about the R2 zone, it's really a moderate density residential zone, appropriate in the following circumstances. really where single-family dwellings predominate the area. Terrain's not harshly irregular, and smaller lot sizes can be accommodated without extensive earthwork. Utilities and other public facilities are adequate for the densities allowed. And existing lot development patterns and policies embodied in the comprehensive plan also guide the application of this zoning district. And then really a single-family residential zone does allow some market and community garden uses, group childcare facilities, and public parks and recreation facilities. Taking a look at Mountain View Road, D Street, they are minor arterials developed to a 36-foot width, paved roadway. There's curb gutter sidewalks on both sides of the street and bike lanes on both sides as well. And there is existing water, sanitary, and storm sewer within the adjacent streets in this area. Staff's recommendation for the commission is to conduct a public hearing, and upon consideration of testimony received, recommend approval of the proposed rezone from farm ranch to the R2 zone with no conditions, and approve the attached relevant criteria and standards that's before you tonight in your packet. And certainly try to answer any questions you have about this.
So commissioners, anybody have questions for Mike?
I have a couple. So on the slide that you have the aerial map, if you don't mind going back to that, Mike. So the property to the north, is that the same owner, just it's in the conservation easement, or how it doesn't go all the way to where the duplex is?
It does, yeah. It's currently under one ownership of this entire property. It's really the same owner as this property to the south as well. It's just currently divided up into this kind of odd parcel configuration where there's a parcel to the north and then these two larger parcels which contain the single family dwellings on those. But yeah, this whole area, I think there's an exhibit attached to your packet that shows kind of the lot sizes that surround the conservation easement that immediately surround those single family dwellings there.
Okay.
So we wind up with a T shape. We wind up with hay or grass in the top and down the middle as a T shape, and then the two properties are set. You have that in there, don't you, somewhere?
A little bit of a horseshoe config. Yeah, there really you can just see the developed land immediately adjacent to the single family dwellings. That's really pretty much represents where the property lines eventually are being proposed. So there will be a little bit of frontage on D Street for the field, as well as to the east of the second dwelling there on D Street as well.
I thought there was a drawing somewhere that made that really clear.
So Mike, I'm struggling to understand the relationship, if there is one, between the rezone and the conservation easement.
There really is none. We have no control over the conservation easement. You know, it's understood that I believe certainly the applicants could speak a little bit more about that. But typically conservation easements are usually around 99 years before they expire. So at some point in the future, you know, we really just look at current comprehensive plan, land use designation, what this property could be developed as in the future, if that conservation easement should go away at some point in time.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thanks, Mike. And with that, we will open the public hearing. And if we could hear from the applicant first.
I'm Paul Clark. I'm an attorney and I represent the Fosburg Manor LLC that's made the proposal. They're the owners of the property. So the explanation was perfect. I guess I don't really have much to add other than the whole goal is to divide the parcel so they can sell the house on the corner. It's been a rental for years, and the family that owns it's the grandchildren of Maynard and Margaret Fosburg, who passed away, Maynard last year and Margaret a couple years before. So their goal is to just get rid of that rental house on the corner, but maintain, obviously they can't get rid of the conservation easement. It's stuck to the land. And they're going to, so that's the only reason to do the whole thing. We just want to divide that parcel so it can be sold separately from the rest. The two houses there on the north side of D Street were never in the conservation easement. the description just went around them and left those two with just as houses, but it was the zoning, the city said we had to do it this way. Rezone it before we divide the parcels. So that's the whole deal.
Say that last part again. Who said it had to be rezoned before?
The city, when I asked them,
Ah.
I went to talk to them, I said, how can we divide this parcel to sell the house? And they said, well, you have to have it rezoned first and then
Okay.
you can divide it. So
Great.
that's,
Great.
hopefully that's correct.
Okay. Thank you. So, any questions for Mr. Clark? And anything else to add?
I don't have anything else.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And do we have anybody that would like to speak in support of the project? Seeing none, anybody in opposition? Seeing none, we will close the public hearing. So how would you all like to proceed? Don't everybody talk at once.
I think it's great. I think it fits right in.
I read through it several times. The concern is to make sure the conservation part stays conservation, and it's not changing that. That's what I mean by that T. I thought I saw a picture in here somewhere, but I didn't see it again. So it's not changing anything of concern. The intent is to keep the hay and the grassland, and every single inch of it will be.
Okay.
So
Okay, so any other questions, comments? So do we have a motion to move forward?
I'd recommend approval of the rezone.
Okay, so Dennis moved. Do we have a second? Drew, second. Okay, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? And abstentions. Okay, we're going to do something a little different on this. We're going to ask that the relevant criteria and standards be approved here at this meeting. I'll explain afterwards a little bit why we're doing that. And Mike, do you have any comments on the fact that we're doing the RCS tonight?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we'll just hopefully approve it tonight. You know, the whole goal, I think, was to cancel the meetings in February. And so that was we didn't really have any agenda
Correct.
items for that first meeting. And that was
Okay.
really why we were, looking at doing that tonight. And I sent that out. I think Jennifer sent it out
Right. Yeah.
Monday morning.
So just a quick comment on that. I kind of like the concept of doing the RCS concurrent with the approval. My only concern is, what if we add a condition that needs to be, or there are some amendments? Can we then at the next meeting, not necessarily the meeting immediately after, can we ratify any amendments, changes? I like the idea that we're doing this at this point. I'd like to sort of carry on with that as a regular practice, as long as, I don't know if you have any other issues or comments about it, but any changes, that was my only concern, is if we have to make any changes, do we just come back and ratify it?
If there are any changes, we'd probably just bring it back at the next meeting, not approve it at say this meeting, but bring it back next meeting. And then the commission would have a chance to review what those
Okay.
changes were and approve it at the next meeting.
But in the meantime, the applicant could move forward with whatever approval has been made for the first part of the public hearing. The idea is to keep things moving, right?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so given that, do we have a motion to approve the RCS as written?
so moved.
Okay, Victoria moved, second,
I'll second.
and Dennis second. So all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed and abstentions. Okay. So that one is all done. Thank you very much, Mr. Clark, for joining us. The next item is another public hearing. I have some comments to make. As you may recall, that when this was approved, I recused myself from the public hearing on advice of city attorney because of a relationship that I'd had with the applicant. At that time, I was asked to absent myself from the meeting, and I rejoined. So one of our vice chairs ran the meeting. I consulted our city attorney, and we agreed that I will recuse myself from discussion and the vote on this. She doesn't feel I need to absent myself from the meeting, so I'll continue to run the meeting, but I will not participate in the discussions or the vote. So with that, Mike, you're
Do
on.
we
Thank
have
you again.
enough votes? If you don't vote, are we a little shy of the number?
Well, I'll abstain. We don't have to have a quorum for the approval, right?
No.
So
Oh, okay.
what I'll do is when the vote comes, I'll abstain, and that should, at least everybody's counted. Does that seem appropriate? Okay, all right, sorry, go ahead.
And just one note, this isn't a public hearing. This is just a review of the final
Oh.
plat. So we already had that, taken care of.
I think I did that the last time we had one of these. Sorry about that.
That solves that question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
So if you recall, this is Anderson's 7th edition. It is a 5.88 acre area. And the subdivision plat at the time was to create 18 lots with an average lot size of 12,971 square feet. Just a little bit of background. On June 21st of last year, the council approved the addition with 3 conditions. The first one was Lot 7, Block 5 shall be converted to a flag lot with a flagpole portion providing direct access to Sunnyside Avenue, and no vehicular access shall be permitted off of Palouse River Drive. And if you recall, it's because of the minor arterial classification of Palouse River Drive and safety conflicts close to that intersection. And then street frontage improvement shall be required on the north side of Palouse River Drive adjacent to the subject property to include installation of curbing, sidewalk, roadway widening to improve Palouse River Drive to a 34-foot width. And then the final condition that a pedestrian pathway connect Cloudy Court with Anderson Frontier Park shall be increased to 10 feet in width. And that was per an original condition that was placed upon a rezone that occurred in the 90s. So January 5th of this year, the applicant submitted the final subdivision plat to be reviewed by the commission as well as city council. And that's what we're in the process of doing tonight, the first step here. So just to familiarize yourself again with the property, it was really 2 pieces of property that were bisected by Sunnyside Avenue. You can see Palouse River Drive here to the south, Sunnyside, current terminus here on the south end, and then currently terminates here on the north end. This is platted right away that has already been platted as part of Anderson Frontier additions. This is Prospect Place, which is a PUD and subdivision here that the commission looked at a few years ago here to the west. Looking to the south, you have ITD Service Yard, various manufactured home parks. This to the east is Gritman's Martin Wellness Center. And then to the north is single-family homes with an Anderson Frontier addition. So this is the final plat that's been submitted. Really much the same as the preliminary plat. You can see that a couple of those conditions, so the modifications have been made. This was the lot in question here with frontage on Palouse River Drive. You can see the flagpole portion that's been created, provides access to Sunnyside Avenue. Changed the name of Cloudy Court, which was the cul-de-sac here. Currently, Ben Gifford Court is the proposed name on that segment. And then we verified the width needed here. So this is the easement that originally connected what they were referring to as Cloudy Court with Anderson Frontier Park, which is to the west here. And that width is sufficient to accommodate a 10-foot wide pathway to satisfy that condition as well. And then, of course, with the construction drawings, we verified that the street frontage improvements on the north side of Palouse River Drive are included as part of those. So they've satisfied those 3 conditions that the council required. So the staff has reviewed the final plat for conformance with city and state code requirements and preliminary conditions of approval and found both to be in conformance. And therefore, we recommend the commission recommend approval of the final plat for Anderson 7th edition to city council with no condition. And I'd certainly try to answer any questions you have.
Just remind me, as Sunnyside went up north, remind me what you said about how it infringes onto the next piece of property. But that didn't seem to be a problem, but I can't remember what you said at that time.
As far as just tying in to that
Yeah,
property to the
well,
north?
It crosses over, it appears to cross over into the property that the hospital owns.
Yeah, and it looks like it's been dedicated as right of way.
Uh-huh,
So, yeah.
okay. I knew you had an answer, but I just needed to be reminded.
Yeah, you can see that right away has been dedicated as part of that.
Right,
So
okay.
that's currently what it looks like there.
Good.
Okay, is that, any questions for Mike? Okay, so how would you like to proceed?
I would recommend approval to city council
Okay, we have a
for
motion
the Anderson 7th edition.
You have a
and-
second?
and Nell second. All in favor?
Aye.
Hi.
Opposition and abstentions. Jennifer, mark me down as abstention if you would. So, okay, we've got that approved. Thank you very much. All right, the exciting main event of the meeting tonight. So pleased to have Tyler here to talk with us about water issues, and thanks to Councilwoman Truccio for also attending. She is the city council liaison for PBAC, and thank you very much, Gina, for coming. And so, Tyler, it is all yours.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, it's great to be here tonight. I really appreciate being here. Anybody who's listened to me ramble on about water knows this is just one of my absolute all-time favorite topics. I never thought I was going to go into public service. I thought I was going to be a lawyer. Dad was a lawyer. Grandpa was a lawyer. It took a few pre-law classes in college and then getting a seasonal job with the public works department. And I was fixing a water line one day and just couldn't figure out why I loved it so much, but knew that I loved it that much. And so I caught the bug really early on, and water was my first love in infrastructure. And so it is something I do love to talk about. I appreciate getting the time to talk about this. It's such a critical issue. It's a critical issue everywhere in the world. And we've become more and more acutely aware of that in the past several years, which I think is a very good thing. And here on the Palouse, it's a very important issue. It's been a very important issue for a lot of years, and there's some very exciting things happening. So I'm very happy to be here to talk about that tonight. As you mentioned, there are a couple of people here in the audience that I am going to go over. What I'd like to do is go over in some detail the context of the water issue here on the Palouse. I would like to be able to comprehensively enough give an idea for what is going on. And I know that it'll be redundant for a lot of people. I've got Councilor Truccio, David Hall, who could give this presentation probably better than I could. So definitely got some folks in the audience that this is going to be very redundant for, but I'm going to go ahead and dive in. I'm going to run through some background, first of all, on the basin, the history of the basin, the history of the efforts at the water problem and defining that water problem. And I'm going to try and put that into context for what that means today, what it is that we're seeing and what progress we're making and what sort of options we have as we move forward. Certainly going to leave plenty of time for any questions that you all may have, and I'll do my best to answer those. So with that, we will dive right into this. So the Palouse Basin Aquifer Committee is an organization through which we have several entities that cooperate on finding the solution on a long-term, sustainable, healthy water supply for the Palouse Basin. Those entities are the City of Pullman, the City of Moscow, Layton, Whitman counties, the University of Idaho, Washington State University. We also have the City of Pullman, or excuse me, so the City of Palouse that is also included in our basin, and they make a contribution to some of our administrative accounts. And then we have participation from the Idaho Division of Water Resources and the Department of Ecology, which are the two state organizations that are charged with water resource management for the respective states. PBAC is a unique organization. It's something that gets applauded and looked to nationwide. The old saying in the West is whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting. And usually when you start talking about water, it's attorneys that are in a room. And it's really remarkable that it's our elected officials and our staff that we have in this room working collectively to solve this problem and in good faith with one another to solve this problem. And so it's been a really wonderful thing to be involved in. And really have made some great progress. what PBAC does, PBAC collects data and funds groundwater research. So there are the 4 major pumping entities, which are the 2 cities and the 2 universities. And so each of those entities contributes both an administrative amount and a research amount to help fund research on the basin so that we can help define the problem. You know, first step in solving a problem is defining the problem. What is the problem? What is the scope of the problem?
And just absolutely a weird little tiny question. It means that Troy is not in, they do not take water out of this aquifer.
That's correct. Troy does not, Genesee does not, and Potlatch does not. So yeah, those are all outside of it. I believe I have a map that'll show that here in just a little bit. Supplying the communities with vital information, providing strategic long-term water supply solutions, and then public engagement and communication. Those are the 4 main missions that the Palouse Basin Aquifer Committee has. This is a cross-section of our aquifer. It's really busy and it's really small, and so I'm not going to make everybody squint and try and look at this, but basically what you have is you have Pullman here as you work this way to the east toward Moscow Mountain. So it tapers off with the granite that is in Moscow Mountain right here. We have in Moscow, we have available to us a shallower aquifer that is known as the Wanapum aquifer. By the time you get over to Pullman, which is about 300 feet elevation difference, that aquifer is no longer available. They only can draw from the Grand Ronde aquifer, which is the deeper aquifer, which Moscow also draws its water from. So Moscow is the only pumping entity that is in the shallow aquifer, the only major pumping entity. A lot of the rural folks in the county, almost all of the rural folks who have their own well, are on the shallow aquifer. But Moscow is the only major pumping entity that has a well in the shallow aquifer anymore. The University of Idaho used to have wells in the shallow aquifer, but they no longer have functioning wells in the shallow aquifer. So the Grand Ronde is where we pull most of the water from basin-wide, and that's a deeper aquifer. Now, there is some interaction between these aquifers. They are not completely separated from each other, but we do have a relatively complicated system. We have a basalt aquifer system where there's a lot of fractures and a lot of pockets and segments, and so it can be a very interesting aquifer to study.
So just from my eyeballs, go back, which color is the Grand Ronde?
So the Grand Ronde sediments, and I'll forward this on as well, Nels, so that you can take a closer look with something. The Grand Ronde sediments are right in here, and I'm colorblind, so I'm not gonna name a color because I'm colorblind.
Or is it,
I'll get it wrong.
is it that yellowy fingered thing?
I really am colorblind, but there are water bearing levels that are
It's purple.
these purple areas right through there. Yep. So the history of where any city exists, the reason that it's where it's at is because of the availability of fresh water, period. That is why every city worldwide is where it's at, is because people, that's the first thing we look for. It's the first thing that you have to have in order to settle an area is fresh water. And the Palouse is no exception. When people arrived here, and that may be surprising because you look around and you don't see a big lake and you don't see a big river and you say, well, like, why here? But there were artesian wells here. They popped through artesian. There was some small, it was a small farming community, but then they started trying to dig wells. And when they popped through that clay layer, there was artesian water just coming out, just like crazy. You had over 3 million gallons a day just popping out of the ground. And so there was a lot of water under pressure that was coming out. And so that's when they decided, oh, wow, this is a great place. We're going to settle Moscow Pullman. So over time, though, because they almost immediately after they dug those initial wells, they noticed that the water table started going lower and lower and lower. So instead of just popping out of the ground, they started having to pump from the ground. And from pumping from 5 feet deep, it went to 10 feet deep, went to 20 feet deep, and continued to get deeper and deeper. And so I think sometimes it seems like a long time ago when we talk about when the area settled, but it really wasn't, if you think about it. You know, the 1890s was not all that terribly long ago. I mean, my great grandmother, who I met and spent a lot of time with, was born in 1898. And so we're not talking about all that crazy amount of generations removed from this. And so as that started to decline in the late 40s, they started to notice that there was an issue, that there was actually an issue with the aquifer. And it was actually some folks that were at the university, because the shallower aquifer is more responsive to the pumping. So the Grand Ronde has a more consistent and less extreme decline rate, but the shallow aquifer reacts more dramatically to pumping. And so since the university was pumping in that shallow aquifer, and so was the city, these two gentlemen here, Kenneth Dick, who was actually the founder of what became PBAC, and George Gagan. I'm
Jagan.
guessing.
Jagan.
Jagan? Is that what we're saying?
Jagan.
Jagan. All right. He was an engineer for the University of Idaho. And so they were looking at the Moscow Well 2 data, and they noticed that, wow, there's this precipitous decline in the water levels in this aquifer, and we need to start looking at this and come up with a solution. So over the years, there have been several solutions that have been put forward. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about all of these, but some of them were significant, and some of them got very, very far along in the process as far as an alternate water supply. This was one in 1967. In 1967, there was a proposal to build a dam or a series of dams on the Plat River. And what was amazing about this was the amount of water that they were talking about in this water right. It was almost 3 times the amount of water that all entities in the basin are currently pumping, was the amount of water that they had applied for in this water right. And so they went through this process. They had the engineering done. They looked at the whole thing. And the thing I think is important to take away from this is the reason that it fell apart is that the public was not made aware. It felt like decisions were made behind closed doors. And then all of a sudden, a plan is shown that has this giant reservoir. And there's people that the first time they've ever seen this is when they see a map with their land underwater. And obviously, people don't respond all that well to that. And so there was a pretty big public outroar. They had a public meeting. And they said, you know what, I wouldn't worry about it. I think you've shot us down. And the publisher from the newspaper kind of took him to task for what he called a shock. He said he was shocked about the secrecy, the perceived secrecy under which this plan was made. So outreach and communication is the reason that one sunk. That's the reason that it didn't continue.
Do you think was it significantly valuable farmland that was going to be underwater?
Definitely some of that, Nels, and also as more alternatives were explored, it was found to be not as financially feasible as some other alternatives that were brought up that became, I guess, more attractive. So in the late 60s, in 67, there was an organization formed called the Moscow-Pullman Water Resources Committee. And that is the committee that later became PBAC. And so they were the ones that came out of the ashes of this failure. And they said, okay, all right, what are we going to do with this? We've got to have more cooperation on this issue, because that really was kind of a unilateral University of Idaho, state of Idaho. Okay, what are we going to do to solve this? And so they started looking at some alternatives. And this was happening in the early 70s. And in the early 70s, what was interesting is that there was a huge power demand anticipated that was supposed to spike super hard through the 90s into the year 2000. So this is the year 2000 they're projecting here. This is the year 2020. And this is the projected electricity need spike that they were anticipating at the time. And so what happened then is that they started to consider ways that they could use water as a battery. And so they looked at what's called a pumped storage scheme. And the pumped storage scheme is basically when there's excess power available, you pump water up a hill, and then the water acts as a battery. So it sits at the top of the hill. And then when there's a need for water, you can release that water, run it through a turbine, and create the electricity. And so it's a relatively inexpensive way to use nature as a battery. And so as they were looking at that to provide power to Central Washington, they said, hey, this might be an opportunity for us to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, build this reservoir appropriately sized that we can pump this water into Moscow and Pullman and use that as a water source. And you're going to see a theme in this. The Army Corps of Engineers had a proposal. They had an earmark in a federal budget. They were ready to really get design started on this process. And a group of farmers formed an organization that was called Opal, the Organization for the Preservation of Agricultural Lands. Because again, the first time they heard of this proposal was when they saw a map with a reservoir covering their land with water. And so they formed this group, and it was a group of 900 folks, and they were able to shoot this down. And the Army Corps said, we want nothing to do with this. We don't want anything to do with 900 angry farmers. And it was great that there was a note. The only thing we have in the historic record for the disbanding of the Pullman-Moscow Regional Water Committee is a handwritten note that says, well, if a research committee can't conduct research, to hell with it all. And that was how they disbanded it. That was the end of that committee. And so there's been kind of an interesting history. Refining the models has been a difficult thing. And so there was always the question of how much water is there? How acute of a problem is this? And so, again, it seems like it's been a really long time, but the time in which this has really been closely studied has only been 50 or 60 years. which when we're talking about something of this scope and scale isn't a ton of time. A lot of these studies take between 5 and 10 years just to conduct a single study to answer one simple question. So there have been a lot of different models that have been created. Through the early 80s, they started looking at some of the projections for what they thought was going to happen with the water supply. Again, I'm not going to take you through all of this. We're really just going to kind of skim the surface of some of these things. But an important date to know is that in 1987, the Idaho Division of Water Resources submitted a letter to the state of Washington stating their concerns about water mining. Water mining is when you're taking more water out of an aquifer than it can recharge. And you can't do that. You have to have a plan to stabilize an aquifer if you have that situation. And clearly we have that situation. We are taking out more water than what can naturally recharge into the aquifer. And so it became a rather contentious issue between the states and between the cities because there's this, what can happen is that the area can be declared a critical groundwater management area. And if it's declared a critical groundwater management area, you basically lose all local control. The state comes in, the state determines everything that happens within that critical groundwater management area. So what happened, the communities responded by resuscitating what had been the Pullman-Moscow Regional Water Committee, and that was when it became PBAC. And that's when membership was extended beyond the cities and the universities to Latah and Whitman counties. And then there was a resolution of understanding that was formed with the Idaho Division of Water Resources and the Department of Ecology in the state of Washington. And what it resolved was that as long as these communities were working cooperatively toward a long-term water solution, that they would not step in and declare it a critical groundwater management area. And so
help us out. It seemed like it was mostly Idaho that was dealing with it, but Pullman uses as much as we do. So wasn't Washington, was Idaho and Washington not on the same page?
I think Idaho was concerned prior to Pullman being as concerned, or the Washington side, primarily because of the shallow aquifer. Since the shallow aquifer showed higher rates of decline and they were only in the deeper aquifer on the Washington side, it wasn't as acute a problem. So it makes sense why for them it wasn't as critical and as poignant an issue as early as it was for those on the Idaho side. So I think that is the primary reason, Nels, that it was garnering more attention on the Idaho side of the border initially.
So I suppose that you would have grown up here. Those of us who were here back in the 50s remember our T-shirts getting yellow all the time because the water it looked like orange juice in the morning. You remember that?
Yeah, absolutely do.
So these are,
Go get your morning drink and it's orange juice and you have a really hard time.
yeah, we even when we flush now, we'll still, so what we have in, the salt aquifer is naturally higher in iron and manganese. And so it's not harmful, but it definitely impacts the aesthetic of the water. And so it's not
very upset because, of course, I tried not to do my own laundry, and she would say, "Why are these shirts all yellow?"
Should have just changed all the school colors to that color of yellow, and we'd all been safe. Yeah. So they formed in 1989. There was the Resolution of Understanding that incorporated all of this and laid out the new goals for this water committee. And critically, in 1992, the Groundwater Management Plan was established. And that was a critical step toward solving this issue and toward appeasing the regulatory agencies that are looking to us to solve this issue. And so the Groundwater Management Plan established thresholds that cooperatively the communities agreed to meet. And so the goals that were set through the Groundwater Management Plan, the most critical thing to know, these are all just, things that we're going to try and do: explore possibilities, promote monitoring, promote conservation, all of this. And in the interest of time, I won't go through every single one of those, but it did establish 125% ceiling over the 1992 pumping level. And so you had the 1992 pumping level. And so it allowed for a 1% increase per year, but not to exceed this 125% ceiling. Now, this is really interesting, and this to me really emphasizes why, and when I say this, in no way am I diminishing the importance of conservation, because conservation is critically important. Because, and the reason that I will say conservation is absolutely imperatively important is that every drop of water that we have to find outside of the aquifers that we have now is going to be significantly more expensive than the water that we are getting out of the aquifers now. And so just from a financial perspective, it's really important. And then the other thing is we're going to be talking about solutions, and we're going to be talking about the horizon for these solutions. And the solutions that we're talking about are 50-year solutions with current rates of consumption. If with conservation, we can turn a 50-year solution into a 100-year solution, we all win, and we all win big. And so conservation is going to be a critical component to any of this. But as you'll see in this graph, we are currently using far less water than we did in 1992, significantly less. And that is despite a 40% growth in population. So we've had very successful conservation efforts, both with system conservation, which is super important. Mike Parker, our water manager, 2 years ago, made some system updates to the way they operate our water system that saved 18 million gallons of water per year. No individual household is going to be able to install enough toilets and enough Yscape to save 18 million gallons a year. It's super important that collectively we all do that, but those systemic changes are huge, making sure that we don't have leaks, that we're identifying them early on, that we run our system in a way that we don't have a lot of waste, that we're flushing the minimal amount that we need to flush to meet regulatory and water quality standards. But all of those things have been very important. So yeah, this is what's really important, is we're using significantly less water than we were in 1992. That's very encouraging. This just goes through those targets by entity.
And when you say we, you're speaking of
Basin-wide.
Moscow and Pullman.
Basin-wide, all pumpers. That's
Cool.
all pumpers within the basin. This breaks down the, these are the 2020 pumping numbers. So this just shows who's pumping what within the basin. You'll see that the U of I domestic is this tiny slice in the pie. And they saw some significant reductions. And the main reason that the U of I is such a tiny slice in the pie compared to WSU, I mean, WSU, obviously the campus is quite a bit larger and a lot more students, but a big component is the reuse water. So we had one of the very first reuse systems in the entire Northwest, and which is something that we should all be immensely proud of. Billions of gallons of water have been saved because the effluent water from Moscow's reclamation facility is pumped to the University of Idaho. And so all the green space at the University of Idaho, including their golf course, is watered with effluent water from the city of Moscow's water reclamation facility.
Tyler, could you go back to the prior slide? Or go one more. Okay. So 2020, the 2.120, is that?
Mm-hmm.
So do you have any data that correlates population, either regional or to
Yes.
our own entity, so that we can see we've got populations increasing and water use decreasing?
I can send you that. I will email to Mike and have him shoot that out to the commission.
I'd like to see that.
Absolutely.
Because one of the key issues for us as we're considering developments is what is the impact, and we really haven't had any metrics to help us be informed to the decisions that we're making. So if we could see that we're actually using less water at the same time we're having a population increase, that
Yeah, this chart is beautiful. And actually, I was afraid we might have 3 or 4 heart attacks in the at our meetings when we had our last subdivisions, because there are people in town who are fearful, and they need a help in understanding where we are.
Yeah.
And some of us have tougher hearts apparently, but I was worried that we might have a heart attack, and that chart would be very helpful.
Well, something that I will say, and it's part of the presentation, but I suppose that's a good segue to it, Nels, is I, for one, have been very encouraged to hear people express concern about water. I love hearing that. It means that they're aware of the water problem. There's nothing more frustrating than to have the most critical component to any human organization, any community at all, is what, like, without the water, it all stops. It all stops. The cell towers can go down, police service can go down, most things can go down, and we can still kind of eke along for a certain period of time. When the water turns off, it's done. Like, that's just it. And there have been a lot of very sobering things that have happened in the last decade. We had a major first world country in South Africa declare a day zero for their culinary water system. They were going to shut it off in Cape Town. It was done. They were going to shut off the domestic supply, and they were going to distribute 6 liters per person per day. That is sobering. And they were in a situation where they had a single source of water without alternate water supplies that they had relied on based on historic weather patterns that had dried up in a lot quicker way than they thought that it would during a drought period. And they hadn't started the process soon enough to develop these alternate water supplies. So there was this overlap. They had things that were kind of in the works, but there was this overlap because, oh, we got time. And then all of a sudden, boom, we don't have time. And so one of the big questions, there's always been a balancing act with PBAC because we are certainly open to the criticism. As I mentioned earlier, the water that we will develop as an alternate water supply will be significantly more expensive than the water we are producing now, period. It will be. This water, we pump it, we barely have to treat it, and it goes right into the pipes, and it's pumped right here in the city. Any of the other alternatives, we're looking at more expensive water. And so there's the question of, okay, well, sure, it's declining, but you look at the depth that we know that we have and the levels that are anticipated within the modeling that we have. We're not running out of water next year. We're not running out of water next decade. We're not running out of water in 2 decades. Now, you're not going to pin anybody down who's going to put a date on it. You're just not going to find someone to do it. There's not enough certainty in what's going on there. No one's going to be foolish enough to do that. But there is the question of, are we doing this too soon? Are we crying wolf? Is this something that we leave like, oh, well, I'll be dead and gone before this is ever a problem. And so why don't we just leave it to the next generation and let them figure it out? And the response that we've had resoundingly from our elected officials and from the participants in PBAC and from the state entities is several-fold. One, water problems are not getting easier to solve. Water rights are not getting easier to get. There's never been an entity in the history of the world that said, shoot, we have too much water. That's just, they're not going to say it. And so it's imperative that we don't become a Cape Town, that we don't kick it down the road and leave this problem for future generations to solve. But that has been a question. And I think that is the balancing point. We don't want people to be so scared of this. We don't want the perception to be we're Chicken Little saying the sky is falling. We're saying, hey, there's a problem on the horizon and we need to solve this problem. Now, is adding the next subdivision going to make us go dry in 2 years? No, it's not. And as I'll send that graph along, but we're using significantly less water than we did in 1992. And so it is that balance between finding a solution. Every city as it grows has to find additional water rights. New York City, Chicago, they didn't start with the number of water rights in the water development that they have now. As the city grows, it's a very normal and natural process during the growth of a city that it's like, oh, just like we need more roads, just like we need more sewer capacity, we have to go out and look for water. And the other thing that I'll say is that as we are looking at the alternatives, actually, I'm getting way ahead of myself. Let me jump ahead a little bit here. I'm way ahead of myself. So this is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
This might be a point to interject, and I'm going on memory, but I remember Maureen being in here as liaison. She said that you had a slide, something about from the 70s, our growth has been 34% in population, but our water use has only been 14%. That's the numbers that I remember.
I'll send out with that graph the update. I know exactly what you're talking about.
So that's ties right into that we've been doing a good job with conservation and fixing leaks and so on and so forth.
Okay.
While she's asking that question, can we, let's look in a global sense, or at least a North American sense. I think New York, San Francisco, and Boston all have water systems that are replenishable, and they replenish themselves. In other words, they're not struggling with this issue exactly. They presume, New York presumes there'll be snow. If snow doesn't come, it could change that. But are we, just as an overarching umbrella, would we want to look for something that seems sustainable?
Oh, absolutely. And that's certainly when I get ahead into the work that we're doing now toward alternate water supplies, I'll touch on that now. So I think that's a really critical point. So this is just it for FYI reasons. This is our water use 2020 versus 2019. All entities pumped less in 2020 than 2019. I can tell you that this number, we've got the numbers, preliminary net numbers coming in for 2021. It's higher. We had a very dry, very hot summer this last year, and dry, hot summers lead to significant increases in pumping, which is why I have a personal vendetta and will wage war on green grass lawns for the rest of my life. It's a crazy luxury we can't afford. So their grass has its place. I'm not saying that it doesn't, and I think that there can be really thoughtful uses of grass, but we can't all run around like little Lord Fauntleroy anymore. This is the pumping change since 1992. And so you can see really significant percentage decreases since that 1992. So this kind of hits to what you were talking about, but I can get you the overall basin number, Victoria. So I'll get that to you. But yeah, you can see really significant. Now, Pullman's the only entity that's seen an increase since 1992, but Pullman has also had the largest population increase. They've seen a really significant population increase, not just within the city, but and the golf course came online since 1992. That's also very important to note as well. Now, this is just a 5-year average by entity, and so you can see that all entities are down on their 5-year average, which is really great to see. So this is the graph that I was talking about. I wasn't sure it was in this one. This is versus population change. So this is exactly the graph, Rob, that you were asking for. And so this will be in the minutes for this meeting.
Thank you.
So that's, and you can dive into it, but you can see this breaks it down. Pullman's pumping versus Pullman's population, Moscow pumping versus Moscow population. So you can see the population increase for Moscow. You're looking at 35% population increase, but a 9% decrease in our pumping. And then Pullman, you've got a 51% population increase and only a 3% increase in pumping. So that's, I believe, is that what you were hoping to see, Rob?
Exactly. Thank
Okay.
you.
So that'll be in here. And if you need me to extract that from the presentation and send just this to you directly, let me know, and I'm happy to do that. Here's another way of looking at the same thing. So this is just kind of flips that. And so it just shows same stuff, different way of looking at it. Okay, so this just gets to the importance of conservation, especially with outdoor usage. When you look at our pumping totals, we have what's called baseline pumping, and that's indoor use. If I can stay on a slide here. Oh, sorry about that, guy. There we go. So this is what we call baseline pumping. It's what we pump in the wintertime when there really aren't outdoor uses. People aren't watering their lawns. They're not washing the car, et cetera, et cetera. And so then you can see 50% of the overall water use happens in a quarter of the year during those summer months. And so there's a real opportunity for us to just change our habits and our water use. I think a lot of times, since we're not in Phoenix, you don't see cactus around. We tend to think, oh, it's the Northwest, we got water, we can green everything up. And it just isn't the case. It's really not the way that we need to be using water. And there's a really big opportunity for us, including the city. You know, we've got a lot of green space. I've really encouraged our Parks Department is actually starting in on a program to review every park and look at where is it appropriate to have grass and where is it not. For the longest time, that was just the default. Oh, it was just put grass on it. And so they're going to go through and say, look, there are certainly appropriate places. We want play fields. We want kids to be able to go out and play baseball, play soccer. Those are appropriate places to have those. Does it need to be in every green strip? Does it need to be in every single nook and cranny of the thing? And no, and we can do some beautiful landscaping that we have some great examples of, including here at City Hall. You know, the City Hall Yscape has been a really successful program trying to showcase that it doesn't mean we're saying let's make landscapes ugly. I think very few people would argue that the Yscape portion of the City Hall landscape isn't more beautiful than the flat grass portion of the landscape. So there are a lot of alternatives that way. Haley?
Has the city explored converting any parks into turf landscaping? Like, I don't know what the pros and cons would be for some
You mean like artificial turf?
Yeah, so you're not having to deal with mud closures and things like
Yeah,
that.
I know that has been looked at. I think as recently as with the newer ball fields that were built there. There are definitely some challenges, some
'Cause it's
maintenance
different
challenges
maintenance and
with
stuff,
those.
right?
Yeah, and I'm really not super well versed in that, Haley. I wouldn't be the best to answer those questions. But if you want any more information on that, I can certainly get it for you. Okay, this is just a lot of very specific pumping data that will be in the presentation that you're welcome to look at if you're interested in it. This just talks about precipitation and how it correlates to that water use. This looks at some of the decreases in use and what we think they might be attributed to in more recent times. Definitely had some COVID decreases, interesting decreases and increases. You know, you saw a huge decrease for the universities, but a little bit of an increase for the cities because a lot of the people who would go to the university during the day to work or go to school and use the restroom there and use the facilities there were now at home doing it. And so it was on the city system instead of the university system, which was kind of interesting. But this is the water decline. So this is the water decline that we've been seeing. Now, the encouraging part about this is the decline at one point was over 3 feet per year. For a long time, it was at about 1 foot per year. And more recently, since about 2006, it's been just over 0.5 foot per year. And this is in the Grand Ronde Aquifer. And so the decline is declining. We are seeing less of a decline than we previously saw, which there are several theories about that, conservation's impact, whether or not that indicates that the aquifer is actually stabilizing, that we are reaching a more sustainable pumping level. And that's something that we've got a lot of research going on, taking a look at and figuring that out. The Wanapum, as I said, is far more volatile. It responds a lot more rapidly to pumping. Back in late 2018, early 2019, the city of Moscow, we stopped pumping our Wanapum wells in any significant way. We pump a little bit just so we make sure we exercise the wells. And there were several reasons for that. One, we really wanted to see how the Wanapum would react. Two, we had well 10 coming on and we needed to use well 10 so that we could get that well operational. And then three, using the Wanapum actually isn't great for us for conservation because the shallow aquifer is far higher in iron and manganese. And so we have to filter that water. And so we have a filter plant right down here on A Street. Both of our Wanapum wells are right there on that A Street property, just A and Main there. And the water that's pumped out of those wells goes directly into a filtration system. It's a black sand filtration system to try and get out some of that iron and manganese. Regardless, some of it makes it into the system. And so that increases the amount of water that we have to flush to clear that iron flock out of the system. And then in addition, we have to use a significant amount of water to backflush those filters. The way those filters operate, you have to backflush them to clean them out. And so we had millions and millions of gallons that we had to use backflushing that system. And so it just wasn't a great way to do it. And then when we pump that hard, that aquifer responds rather significantly. And so another reason that we don't want to pump that shallow aquifer hard is we're the only large pumping entity in that aquifer. And there are a lot of small wells that surround us in the county that are relying on that aquifer. So if we draw that down and draw it below the drawing level of those county wells, we're the big bad wolf in that aquifer. We're the big user. And so we've deemed that it's better for us to focus our pumping and focus on alternate water supplies, but use that deeper aquifer so we're not having the impact on small users.
Surrounding regional agricultural farms, do they go down? Are we talking 300 or 400 feet or?
Generally 200 to 300 feet. Sometimes less than that. It can be anywhere from 100 to 300 feet typically is usually what you're seeing out there.
So Tyler, the well failure is it the Hoodoo well failure, and then the other one that I think Genesee had something else go wrong, but I can't remember if that was like equipment based or if that was them coming up dry.
Those were mostly equipment based.
Okay.
Mostly equipment based. They had some water quality issues as well that led to the need to re-drill the wells, but it wasn't necessarily about the depth of the well.
Okay.
It was more about casing, quality, location. Those were more of the issues that both of those entities had.
Okay.
Yeah. So getting into the current projects. We have several current projects. We've got geologic mapping updates. We've got seismometers that are quantifying recharge up along, and so that we can get a better idea for recharge up along Moscow Mountain. We've got the Palouse water alternatives data gap filling, and then we've got the upgraded groundwater model. The really important one is this third one, the Palouse water alternatives. This is one that we've got Dr. Robin Nimmer working on. She's doing some really great work on this. And this is what I find extremely encouraging, is after that history of starts and fits and stops and working and back and forth, we were at a point where there was a lot of research done to say, okay, let's really wrap our head around this. And then we had an organization called Anchor put out a project to identify, okay, what are our alternatives? What alternatives exist for alternate water supplies? The encouraging thing, and this is something that I think is really important, especially for this group, is there are a lot of entities around the country that as they look at their list of water alternatives for water alternative supplies, it is a very limited list and it is an insanely expensive list. But for us, there was a very long list of potential alternatives that we were able to narrow down to 4 what we think to be more feasible alternatives. And these are groupings of what some of them, one of them is a standalone project. The other 3 are groupings of projects that would meet a 50-year demand horizon. And one of the things that I'd like to emphasize is when I say a 50-year demand horizon, that quantity, so it's the amount of water that we would need with projected growth at current use, with current conservation in place, but it also includes a 30% addition to that, which is the estimate of what we would need to stabilize the aquifer. So an additional 30%. So aquifer stabilization is included in that 50-year horizon. And so that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And so even with that big of a number, we had several what seemed to be very feasible alternatives. So those 4 alternatives were identified, but there were a number. So this was a 30,000-foot study. It was, okay, what's out there? What options are out there? What might be feasible? Taking a preliminary look at things like environmental impact, ability to get water rights, preliminary cost estimation, those sorts of things, engineering feasibility. Can you even build it? Would it even work? Type of a thing. So the next step in that process is what we're engaged in now with Dr. Robin Nimmer and Alta, and they are taking that the next step. They're taking and filling those data gaps. And so their product that they will provide to the Palouse Basin Aquifer Committee is a recommendation for an alternative or a grouping of alternatives. They will come back and say, okay, of these that you identified, this is the recommended route. This is the one. And so they are taking deep dives. They're meeting with fisheries. They're meeting with the regulatory agencies. They're doing further engineering, a whole bunch of stuff, water rights, all of those things to come back and say to us, these are more feasible. But one of the really encouraging things that has come out of that process is with the preliminary estimates that we got from Anchor QEA and the additional work that we're having done by Alta, when people that are involved in water nationwide, especially, who have to deal with the Southwest and even Central Washington, they have some serious water issues in Central Washington. When they look at the cost that we're looking at and the number of options that we have, they're very encouraged. They look at it and they say, wow, you guys are in pretty good shape. Like this is not an unsolvable problem. This is not that I am very confident that we will be able to implement a water alternative supply project. And that's going to be a really cool thing. It'll be one of the largest infrastructure projects likely that we've seen in the history of the Palouse, potentially depending on the alternative that is recommended to move forward. But we do have good alternatives for this. We're not sitting here without alternatives. One of the things that we're trying to do, as you may well anticipate based on the prior attempts at solving this issue, is that we have a lot of outreach that we're trying to do. We do not want this to seem like this is coming. There's a decisions being made behind closed doors. No one's being told about it and no one's being involved. So we have a stakeholder engagement group where we've reached out to a number of stakeholders from a variety of segments to try and get them engaged in the process. We've had PBAC retreats. We have the Palouse Basin roundtable. We've conducted several surveys. We actually presented to the admin committee on Monday about the latest survey that was done with some really encouraging results showing that people really are starting to catch on to this. They're starting to, we had 90, and it was self-selecting these people. It was put out through press release, social media, traditional media, radio, but we had 90% of respondents indicate that they knew who PBAC was, and they knew that there was a water problem on the Palouse, which is super encouraging. That is not something we would have heard even 10 years ago, I don't think. And so that's a really good thing. So we're really trying to have that outreach. And then we have a stakeholder engagement group which is a group that we've met with several times, and we're using them as a sounding board as we work through this water alternatives process to help us look at this, help us identify what might be opportunities that we might be missing or potential obstacles that we're not seeing. And that's been a very helpful group. We have a lot of great research folks here on the Palouse at both of our educational institutions, and we have really good participation. We have some amazing professionals throughout the community. And so it's really an amazing setting to be able to do this. And I think that's the reason it's been able to be so cooperative, is that we do have a lot of folks who are just residents who are really well versed on a lot of this stuff and are able to actually engage in a very meaningful way. And so that's been really good. And we've been really trying to do that engagement. So that's the end of the presentation. My overarching message is do we have a water challenge that we need to solve? Yes. 100% yes. Do I think that it's something that we should kick down the road to my kids or my kids' kids? No, I don't think that's a good idea. I think that the problem is only going to get more expensive, more complicated, more difficult to solve. And I think that we have the right elected officials. I think we have the right staff people. I think we have the right key people in the community that are pushing for this to really get something done. And even so, it's going to be a longer term project. You know, if we get a recommendation from Alta, we vet that and determine that we want to move forward with that. We get the state's buy off. We start to look for funding. You're looking at generally probably a 12 to 15 year horizon for a drop of water from that project being put into a pipe here on the Palouse. These are not quick turnaround projects. They're longer term projects. And so I think it does behoove us to be working on solving that. But is it a problem that we can solve? Most certainly. And are we doing a good job? Yeah. We have, the lowest per capita water use numbers in the entire state are here in Moscow. We have the lowest per capita water use. So that's a really good thing. So with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions you all might have.
So, Drew?
Yeah, thank you. This is really good to get some data to talk about the discussion. So we're talking about a lot of like long-term, kind of long game solutions. What are short-term game solutions? I mean, I know you kind of mentioned some of those, but what are?
I think that's a wonderful question, Drew. I think that it's really easy when you start to look at this to say, oh, we're going to bring on this $120 million project, so let's not do anything in the interim. And we really want to keep in mind that this is not a one and done thing. This has to be a continual process. I think the obvious shorter term thing is enhanced conservation. That is something that we really need to focus on. We need to focus on that internally and throughout the community. And so we've got currently with the city of Moscow, our sustainability and conservation coordinator, Nicole Baker, is conducting a comprehensive review of our water conservation plan. And we actually have a meeting next week where she's going to bring to me, she's taking a look nation and worldwide at what are components of other people's plans that aren't in our plans and ranking them based on which ones we might be able to implement. And so we'll be taking a look at that, coming back to our city council and saying, hey, maybe we could do this, we could do more. So those are some shorter term things. And then within the alternate supply study, there are smaller projects that could be much more quickly implemented. So there are some smaller, there are some smaller supply projects from some of the rivers, they're just directly pulling from the rivers, treating the water, and then putting that water into the system. And so some of those projects, those could be 5-6 year projects. And so those could be shorter term. And so if those are able to if they make their way through the vetting process, you very likely could see some sort of smaller project that could be packaged and put together.
Okay, cool. Well, that answered it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as the water meeting happens annually, it's really going to be important to try to share some of that research ideas with people so that we begin, the broader community begins to understand what you're up to.
Yeah.
Okay,
Great.
Tyler, would you address gray water use? Because, for example, if in a hearing someone said, make the development use gray water, we don't have the capacity to do that now. Would you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. Gray water use can work really well in certain. So a couple things that we get asked a lot is, why don't we expand the reuse system? Why don't we expand that effluent system and, for example, water all the city parks with the reuse system? And, when you look at that just intuitively, at first blush, great idea. Yeah, I mean, why not? But it's one of those that when you actually get down to implementation, it's a whole different story. And so just for example, that expanded use of that system becomes not very feasible because we have an existing reuse system that waters all the University of Idaho green space. And that system takes pretty much every drop that we can get it during the hot months of the summer. So we have a certain amount that I have to continue to put back out into Paradise Creek for running my gauges that I have to have for compliance with our permit, a very small amount. And during the hot months, all the rest of it's already going to the university to keep up with their systems. So if the city of Moscow then said, okay, we're going to spend millions and millions and millions of dollars laying this redundant pressurized pipe system, and I'm going to have to pump it all uphill. So I'm going to have a greenhouse gas impact on what the city is doing because I'm going to have to run a whole bunch of pumps and a whole bunch of filtration systems. And I'm going to have to build a whole bunch of infrastructure across town where most of our parks are on the east side of town. I'm going to incur crazy amount of cost, produce a whole bunch of greenhouse gas emissions, and all just so that the University of Idaho can then turn around and they would have to pump from the aquifer the water that I took away from them that they're no longer pumping. And so we'd be robbing Peter to pay Paul and at an enormous expense for those sorts of things. And so we don't produce enough wastewater. And the other big problem that we have is that, or I guess obstacle for that type of a system is that when we need the water the most is when our flows are the lowest because the students are out of town. We have a third of our town that leaves during those summer months, and that's when we need the flows the most for that use. And so it really precludes that being expanded much beyond what it is. That said, we did include pipe in a sewer project recently over to Gormley Park. That's one that could make sense. It's right there. We can tie into the university system. We've got a tacit agreement with the university. They would allow us to tie into their system, and we could tie Gormley Park onto there. So as we saw water increase as the community grows and we have a little bit more volume that's available, then we could bring Gormley Park onto that reuse system. So that is something that we hope to do on the closer term horizon. And that would be the first city property other than the reclamation facility itself, which all of the green space on the reclamation facility is watered with reuse water. But that would be the first city park that we would bring on.
Your 50-year horizon, what kind of growth are you?
I believe that it was we worked with Bill Belknap on that number, and it was based on then historic and projected growth. I think, Rob, that it was 1.25% annually, but I will revisit and make sure that I get you the actual answer.
That would
on
make sense. I mean, that's kind of been our historical growth rate for since the beginning of time, practically. So,
You think Pullman grew at significantly more than 1% in these last decade, haven't they?
And in the data, Pullman's number is different than Moscow's. And so those growth numbers that are projected to determine that reflect that growth.
You do, I think we need to be vaguely aware of kind of growth that we can sustain, as you're saying. And so I've felt that if we're hanging right around 1%, that just in generic terms, that's something that most civic groups can kind of deal with. When you start growing at 2 and 3%, it gets out of hand. And so Boise Valley, though they don't have the water issue that we do since they have a river, but they've had 3% for 30 years. And so it's hard to imagine that that their infrastructure has, it's amazing if it's keeping up.
I worked for a city on the Wasatch Front where we saw 7 and 8% growth several years ago. It was just absolutely crazy just to see that growth. We couldn't hire staff quick enough to just plow the snow. Like it was just a crazy growth level.
Gina, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you have some council perspectives on this that you could share with us?
Well, I don't know that But I do have an economic development perspective in that, we don't have enough land to go much beyond 1 or 2% growth.
Take care. Yeah.
Annually, period. We just don't, I mean, the free land in our area is what right now? Ag land.
Yeah.
And there's a real push to keep it at that. And so for that, but I do think that, in my experience in the last, it's probably been in the last 2 years anyway, with a site selector or just a general business inquiry, a couple questions come out every single time, usually about the same order. We'd like to come and live in your community. What's the real estate market like, and is water really an issue? There's also a couple church-related questions, but we won't bring those up. The water is a concern, but I do my best and I try to imitate Tyler Palmer as best I can and say, you know, this isn't going to be, we're not going to run out of water in the next 20 or 30 years. And with the way that the city has planned and done its comprehensive plan and worked all of these pieces together, we've got a good path forward at the same time that we're working for this solution. I think it's almost kind of misleading, Tyler, and it just dawned on me this evening listening to you. It's almost misleading the 4 solutions, because I really believe in the end, you know Moscow, you know this region, we're going to end up with a combination
Oh yeah,
of
I agree.
3 of them, you know, and so it'll end up being option.
This piece of this and this piece of that. Yeah, I suspect you're right, Gina.
I'm optimistic though, and people are not, once they get here and they take a look at things and talk to the people, the authorities in our region, it's not an issue. Water is not the issue. I love Victoria's idea of trying to find alternative ways to be able to have green grass. I like it in little spots. But, and I don't know, you know, gray water, I don't know how we do that, catch rainwater, I don't know what the answers are, but I hope too, once we start doing it, I wanted to respond to Drew's question about short term. We're surrounded by these 2 great land grant institutions too, and I would really believe as well we're working towards this bigger solution, that we'll still have some of the research going on, and we're going to find some of these fun, creative, more short-term solutions to our water issues that I think we can still implement as we go along. So I hope that answered your question, Rob.
Yeah, it did. Thank you very much.
One thought, I know that people come here liking freedom and space, you know, but if we could encourage a portion of our inhabitants of Moscow, new people that come, to think about more denser living, then we don't have to even talk about my grass that you've pierced.
I'm so
my heart.
besmirched.
And I know I'm going to.
I never make many friends with my grass diatribes, Reese. I never do.
No, I get it, and I make a lot of enemies at another part of that discussion, but Legacy Crossing is one of those places where we could do some really exotic, if we could find the right money pot, we could develop urban density and urban living that is so attractive. And I'm thinking about Vancouver when I think about this. I think about Vancouver, BC, in terms of how they've talked themselves in to do more interesting urban. And we can't expect everybody who comes from Ohio out here to go to the university or do whatever to want to do that, but some percent. So that would be part of I think a part beside looking for your 4 options.
There's some percentage of
I wanna
people that
know
aren't
more
looking
about
for a
those-
1/4 acre lot.
those
There's some that are,
options.
but there are certainly some that aren't.
I think it's a generational thing too, and I know I'm going out of order, Mr. Chairman,
No.
sorry.
Please, this is a discussion.
But I do believe that there's the generation below ours that doesn't have that expectation of the ranch.
Yeah, I'm hoping that too,
And the
Gina.
higher density and the walkability and the bikeability kind of concept is already built in
Mhm.
to them. So they get here and they can't believe how much space they're in, which is good. But, I think that we are moving towards, even just in a generational way, towards higher density.
Tyler, I'm kind of hung up on the metrics thing. I'm looking at it from the standpoint of when we're considering these developments, and water, of course, is almost always a primary issue, but we don't really have a basis for changing the size of a development, putting conditions on or whatever, because it related specific to water. But in the discussions that some of the PBAC entities have had, is there talk about developing ordinances or specific criteria in developments? And this kind of goes back to where you are too, so that somebody brings a project to us and we're looking at approval or not approval, we can have a way to say, okay, this is the likely impact, this is the effect it's going to have. That's outside the criteria that we've established for this. Are we having those kinds of discussions?
That is outside of PBAC's purview. PBAC's real focus is on the long-term water supply, on researching the basin. So that really would fall more to the respective community development departments. I know that there are some differences, definitely not my wheelhouse, but I know that there are some differences just between the states in what's even allowable between the state of Idaho and the state of Washington. But that would definitely be more, I think, Mike's area of expertise.
Mike, do you foresee us, maybe not in the near term, but even in the medium term, kind of moving toward that sort of developing that sort of criteria?
Well, I think it'd be up to the council to develop that policy. So certainly based upon data that we have, the certain number of units per year restriction based upon the water we have. I mean, looking at the estimates, they were assuming I think it was 1.25% annual growth. We ran the numbers recently. It was at a city council meeting, and the last 20 years we've grown 0.67% annually. So, I mean, that's pretty much half of what we're estimating as far as what that percent annual growth is going to
So
be.
you said 0.67?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I was gonna ask, when these subdivisions are coming up in conversation, is there back of the envelope math that the city's able to do to kind of understand what that impact of water consumption could look like based on
Yeah,
expected houses and occupation?
in every staff report, we typically include the perceived water consumption that could happen, and it's based upon certain 2.25 occupants per household, certain number of gallons per household per day. We include those numbers in the staff reports every time. So
Sometimes the planning department and P&Z take the lead on ordinances or changing an ordinance or developing an ordinance that presents then to city council. I just wondered if this is something that we should be considering to work on. I'm not talking about this year, maybe not for the next 5 years, but maybe start to think about doing that kind of work collaboratively, not so your organization, us, and then council working together. I would like to stay proactive as a commission in the issue anyway. So, Haley?
So is it an annual survey that PBAC sends out as far as in feeling out who, like the answer to the question of, do you know what PBAC is, or do you know that we're drawn on an aquifer? The 90% thing that you're talking about.
That was the first basin-wide survey that we've done.
I guess as a council member, what I would hope to hear to better ground whatever decision we made as council would, if there is another survey that happens sooner than later, I'd want to know what the public feels about policy about as far as what that impact would look like. I mean, I'm all for it. I'm actually really excited to potentially Y-scape our front yard. But I had something you mentioned earlier, Tyler, about difference in states. And there's an urban legend, Moscow urban legend about rain barrels and water rights. And so I'm trying to wrap my head around the water rights in Idaho.
Water rights in Idaho are consumptive. And
Okay.
so rain barrels are completely allowable in the city of Moscow. You can use rain barrels.
Great.
That's allowable.
Okay. There was knocking on doors. There was some miscommunication there. And so I didn't have a great answer. The other thing
We've actually got rain barrels that water the Y-scape over at my building.
on the side.
So
I love it.
So yeah.
And then the other thing that came up, is it true that WSU's golf course they don't have a water reclamation
That's
thing?
true.
They don't water with gray water.
One of the alternatives that was looked at in the initial study was the feasibility of a reuse system similar to Moscow's, where Pullman's reclamation facility would pump their water up and water Washington State's green space, including their golf course. One of the primary issue with that is they're ranking these projects. You look at gallons per dollars. Like, what's the best bang for your buck? Where do you get the most? And there are other projects that both WSU and Pullman can do that they get way more water for way less money. So while that, from a narrative perspective, is a very attractive project, from just a dollars and cents perspective, it's not the best project for them to engage in. So you would really have to have factors outside of just efficiency be the factors.
But the other solutions that they're talking about as far as dollars per gallon gallons per dollar would still adjust their piece of the pie, right?
Exactly. That's exactly it. And that's really been the balancing act as we look at, some of these solutions are on the Idaho side, some are on the Washington side. Some of them would be a regional collaboration that then you'd form some other group that would then basically run that and then sell the water to both entities. Throughout the process, it's making sure that there is balance between each state's efforts to solve the water problem.
Yeah.
Because that's been the real motivation to stay in PBAC and cooperate with PBAC, because there have been the temptation at times over the years where it's like, oh, we'll just go build our own reservoir on Moscow Mountain and say forget about it. State of Idaho give us some money, we can just cut Washington out of this deal and we'll just go do our own thing. The problem is then the ratepayers in the city of Moscow bear the entire burden of stabilizing the aquifer, which isn't a fair situation for our ratepayers.
Well, and if Pullman finds themselves in that situation without a Moscow Mountain,
Yep.
And then I had two other thoughts. The uphill pump conversation from the 60s, from what I remember from my engineers telling me about things at SEL, it is the most efficient way to generate and store energy is to have the cyclic.
Well, and everything that's old is new again.
Yeah.
And so there are conversations that are happening now with Avista's new goals for green electricity that include a pump storage again. And so there may be the possibility of some collaboration where, the utility company may need to build something. They throw a lot of money at it and we can cooperate. So that could really change the dynamic
It's
of
cool to
what
see
alternative
Well, and
comes
I
up.
hadn't heard of it until a few years ago. And so I love that it had been on the table before then. And then the last thing I think the thing that we have working against us in some ways is our landscape and our scenery. I think people feel so emotionally attached to our rolling hills that when a new subdivision goes in and you lose that backyard view of the combine going over twice a year or whatever. I mean, I think, and a house is there instead. I think in some ways our geography works against us in terms of that public misconception of what an impact of a subdivision can mean. Because it is farmland changing into residential land. But at the same time, we've seen huge improvements in agricultural production and the rate of what you're able to produce in that same footprint. So that's been something that's really stuck with me is we're not looking at what you see on the west side of Western Washington, where you can tuck a house into some trees and you can kind of drive by and not see it. It's a very visible thing when there's a new house that goes up in the Palouse. So anyway, that's my.
Gina?
I want to go back to your question about the idea of metrics on subdivisions and the size they're in and whether or not we would ever get into a moment of policy making there. I think your attitude, as always, and we have many years of being able to say this to each other, is very good. And I think that the proactive approach to anything that gigantic is very important. And these commissions are where we get our information, right? This is part of our information. So when you guys, as planning and zoning with 5 other people thrown in, come up with an idea like this and vet it and get it to the council. That's the way that kind of stuff happens. So I encourage you, but boy, I tell you what, get your armor on.
Yeah.
'Cause that is rife
Mm.
with potholes.
I think we know.
Yeah, I
Thank you, though.
support your thought, and I really, this was a very good, important meeting, and I believe we need to have it regularly. And I think that while Mike's right, the city council has to be the one that puts a stamp on something. Our suggestions, they listen to us.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to look across the country to find people who are having the water issue. I do think that human race will end up fighting over water before they fight over oil.
Well, yeah,
I
for sure that.
honestly do. I think you're right about that. And I think there's no doubt that we'll kill each other over water because we have to have water. We don't have to have oil.
Right.
So anyway, we should continue to work on it and be able to give advice.
Yeah, no, and before, Mike, one of the thoughts I'm thinking out loud here, but just kind of to bring this full circle, I'm thinking, well, the next comprehensive plan review is an opportunity for us to push this forward, maybe in a way that we haven't before. So that's just kind of off the top of my head thought. So.
Yeah, we could certainly add to the current section. I think it's natural resources section in the comp plan.
Yeah.
I think just what I've always struggled with is just how the resource is not entirely quantified. And
Yep.
we don't know exactly how much water's down there to be able to ration it in a way that we would limit development. And
Yep.
so, just all the data that Tyler's presented tonight, I mean, there's just so many unknowns as far as the fluctuations.
That's always been the difficult part, is that there's not a toehold that if Mike comes to me and says, hey, what are we using as our baseline? How much is available?
Yeah.
You're not going to find anybody that can answer that question in any sort of realistic way. And so identifying a metric that you would use becomes very difficult when we don't have that concrete.
But the research is heading that direction, kind of.
It is better defining recharge. I don't think the research will ever get to the point where anyone will be able to definitively say, this is how much water this aquifer
there
holds.
is,
This
yeah.
is what there is. I just do not
that's-
think that is
Yeah.
we won't have the ability in my lifetime to quantify that.
And that's, Mike, your point's well taken about that. I mean, you got to kind of have a baseline, but within that we can work with. Victoria, I'm sorry, you go.
Well, I was going to throw out a couple of monkey wrenches. That one ties right in. In terms of quantitative. The rivers hold X amount of water, but as we lose snow, we lose water precipitation, we move into climate challenges here. We won't have as much water as we think we have. And so that's going to mess with the data. And I don't know how much PBAC is able to figure out a range or able to react to that. And another point, and I don't want you to answer that, but I also want to echo a point that I believe Julia said in the administrative committee meeting, that the self-selected survey that went out was self-selected, which means people who care were the people who responded.
Right.
So a lot of people out there don't respond, and so they are not educated, or they don't think there's a problem, or they want to deal with it, or I'm going to die before, that kind of thing. And so there's going to be an edge of how
we reach those people.
Yeah. And so I just want to echo that because she made a really good point, and I want to echo that. But go back to this quantitative data where does the water come from? And the water comes from weather, and weather is changing, and climate is changing.
So both in the original research that was done by Acre QEA identifying the alternatives, and then again in the work that Alta Science and Engineering is conducting right now, they have climate change variability built into those models. And so that is something that we are taking into account. with the best data that they have, looking at what the projections are for how that impacts our area. Because it's critically important. I think Rob mentioned earlier that we have entire water systems in this country. Look at like the Wasatch Front, where I used to work, completely dependent on snowpack acting as snow storage. They don't have reservoirs big enough to store the amount of water they have. They rely on it slowly trickling into a reservoir, and the snow being the primary point of storage, and then being able to feed down through. And so now as that gets disrupted, it's not just oh, well, it doesn't matter. It just comes as rain instead of snow. Now we're fine. It's like, no, you can't build a reservoir big enough to hold that much water. And so there are big disruptions. Luckily, in the projections that we see for our area, we are not as acutely impacted as some areas of the country in the climate models. And so that does help. But those are accounted for in that work, Victoria.
Did you have anything? No. So I'd like to go on record saying, and picking up on what you just said, we should do this every year. Have you, Gina, and let's just make sure that we stay informed on this issue. I'd like to make this an annual kind of a thing. So I really appreciate you taking the time. This has been really educational.
I appreciate the commission taking the time for
thank
it.
you.
Truly, I do. It's such an important topic, and your attention to it is appreciated, and more than happy to come back annually and update the commission.
That'd be great. And Mike, thank you for your effort in getting this arranged. And Gina, thank you for taking your evening and coming. So this is super. I think we all just very much appreciate
Thanks for
having you here today. So with that, we just got a couple of other items. We're going to work through Transportation Commission meeting. Joel isn't with us tonight, so we will forego that. The original schedule said that we were going to have a meeting for February 9th. We're going to cancel that meeting, as well as, what is it, February 23rd, I believe, Mike? So we will have no meetings in February. Our next meeting will be, what is the date? Anybody got a calendar? What date in March that's going to be? March 9th. Okay, great. Okay, super. Anything else for the good of the order? Okay.
Let me ask.
Yeah.
Because Joel's not here, but it's been in the paper. Transportation Commission probably looked at e-bikes, and do you want to say anything about that? Just because it has been in the paper, the scooters and the e-bikes. And we're talking about mobility.
Right. No, I was
We're
reading.
talking about mobility and stuff. So was there anything from that? Were you at the meeting? Was there anything that you could add or want to address?
Yeah, I mean, I think that transportation made a recommendation, and it went all the way up to committee last time. It got put on hold for about a year, and now Cody's actually bringing that back up. There are a couple minor tweaks, I think, to largely the downtown area. As far as I think initially, that's where it got hung up with committee, was maybe a speed limit where they'd be restricted in the downtown area. And it sounds like there may be a map that's defining an area where it's a dismount zone for all sidewalk riders of e-bikes and e-scooters in that area. And so that was really the major change. And I believe the agreement with the providers, there's some minor tweaking of that as well. And that's going to come back to administrative and public works and be reviewed again in the next, I think, month or two, and then on to council. So.
Okay, great. With that, meeting is adjourned. Thank you all so very much. We'll see you on the 9th of March.